Right, so the phrase Two Tier Keir has been coined by Elon Musk to describe Keir Starmer in order to conflate his latest conspiracy theory, essentially, that white Britons are treated more harshly than ethnic minorities in sentencing. Well, being a product of apartheid South Africa as Musk is, he'd know all about that, I presume, I would expect. But while Musk's definition of Two Tier Keir might be wide of the mark, the nickname actually ought to stick. Starmer made that ridiculous speech the other day, didn't he? Days after the riots began, all a bit late, blowing hard about the full force of the law being applied to the people taking part in the riots. But it isn't actually true. It isn't being. And comparing those sentences to some recent other ones, well, actually it begs the question of how severe a problem Starmer actually views rioting at all. How much of a problem intimidation of ethnic minorities is in his eyes. And there's one big, fat, glaring example of why those rioting sentences are a complete joke, along with any claims Starmer might be making of stamping his authority on such matters, because he's more interested in stamping his authority on other matters completely. Right, so come on then, Damo, what is this big, fat, glaring problem with these sentences then? Well, not exactly very big, are they? Of every sentence handed out already for a rioting offence, not one of them has been longer than, for example, any of those Just Stop Oil protesters got the other week, just for going on Zoom and planning to block a road as that was. 5 of them, and they got 21 years between them, of course, didn't they? 5 years for one of them, 4 years for the rest. Every single rioter so far that's been sentenced has got a shorter sentence than that. Obviously, many of these cases are yet to be heard. They're going to be going on for weeks, I would imagine. But where things started off with these nationwide riots up in Southport, we've seen a guy who was found guilty of violent disorder and who punched a police officer in the face get sentenced to just 3 years, and that is the longest sentence so far handed out to any rioter. Another man who tried to set fire to a police van, which ended up getting written off at cost to the public purse at £32,000, but he got just 30 months. Another guy who turned up drunk and admitted to violent disorder as well got 20 months. Why are the sentences for rioters so low compared to environmental protesters? And who in this latest example got heavily sentenced before they'd actually done anything? This is the reality of Two Tier Keir. So far, 5 rioters have been sentenced to a combined 12 years, so an average of 2.4 years each, versus 5 environmental protesters who got a combined 21 years. Rioting is effectively half the sentence of climate campaigning these days in Keir Starmer's Britain. Which do you consider the bigger crime, setting fire to police vans and smacking a copper in the teeth, or planning to block a road in a non-violent manner to make a political point? In case you're amongst the hard of thinking, I'll help you out a little bit. One of these is a human right. Only the other one is a crime, and the crime carries less of a punishment than the human right to protest does, in the world of former human rights barrister Two Tier Keir. Just to show how much more ridiculous the situation is, Just Stop Oil yesterday announced they were pausing all of their legitimate action because of the riots, redirecting their efforts to show solidarity. They're campaigning their members and their volunteers to join the counter-fascist protests, continuing to do so in their characteristic non-violent manner, joining communities around the country to stand up to and resist fascism on our streets. Now I know there are those out there who might be watching this shaking their heads and vehemently disagreeing with my assessment here so far. Why are you siding with Musk for calling Starmer Two Tier Keir? Well, I'm not. Have you not been listening? Just because a right-wing conspiracy theorist with more money than sense coined the phrase is irrelevant. If he wasn't being so conspiratorial about it, he might realise Starmer is far more on his side than that of ordinary working-class communities taking a stand against fascism. Far more on the right wing than the left, who, like me, are calling this out and redefining what Two Tier Keir should mean, rather than what Musk intended it to. There will be others shaking their heads and saying the sentencing for 2 different crimes, as they might well see it, shouldn't be compared, and that many, many rioters are yet to be sentenced, and I could have all this completely wrong, and I might be leaping to conclusions prematurely. But I'd still ask you to justify those Just Stop Oil sentences when they hadn't actually done anything. They were simply meeting on Zoom and planning a protest, versus the criminal damage and violence we've been witnessing for the last week, the terrorism, frankly, that has been taking place on our streets. And yet the sentences don't fit the crime. Many are calling these riots terrorism. Terrorism against Muslim communities, against ethnic minorities, whipped up by political attacks over immigration, as this has been. In no small part has that been done by Keir Starmer himself, his attacks on small boat crossings, his attacks particularly on Bengalis, sounding every bit the Tory shill he actually is. But it seems it doesn't get called terrorism and so many of the perpetrators are white, does it? Until the rioters start getting bigger sentences than environmentalists planning peaceful protest have got, the calling out of the double standard in sentencing isn't going to go away. And with so much sentencing likely still to come, if the sentences don't start befitting the crime shortly, yet the right wing, the supporters of the criminals, the racists are all over social media complaining that the opposite is true, that white people are getting singled out and punished unfairly and people of colour let off for their violence. I haven't seen a single person of colour telling a white person to go back to their own country. And that's the problem. Perhaps Just Stop Oil have got the wrong idea. The message from Two Tier Keir seems to be, well, if you'd punched one of the arresting officers, you might have got a lighter sentence. Is that not where we are now? Now, Starmer could deal with this. He could deal with the sentencing issues if that is the case. The Tories making environmental protest a bigger crime, despite being a human right, than rioting, it seems. Certainly I've seen a comment along these lines from environmentalist and journalist George Monbiot. Starmer could speak to the CPS. He is familiar with them, isn't he? We all know that by now, don't we? Get them to look at those sentencing guidelines. It's one aspect of the CPS's job. It's what they're there for. That sentences are getting handed down to the thugs, terrorists and violent offenders involving themselves in egregious acts upon our country is good and right. They are too lenient when environmentalists are getting sent down for so much longer. It doesn't matter how many of them get sentenced in the coming days and weeks. If the sentences continue to be handed out are lower than those the environmentalists got, if light sentences of a few months, a couple of years for the most violent attacks, as has been the case thus far, are all that is being given, then it doesn't really feel like justice is being done, does it? And it also doesn't feel like much of a deterrent for people who clearly get their rocks off by committing these foul acts. There's another reason this discrepancy falls foul upon Starmer particularly, though. Whether you're of the opinion, as I am, that the climate protest sentences were overpoweringly disproportionate, or that perhaps you're of the opinion that the rioters' sentences are not tough enough. This little nugget here goes back to the last lot of riots the country endured. We need to go back to 2011 and look at what happened then. At that point, Keir Starmer was still Director of Public Prosecutions. He was head of the CPS, of course. Sentencing was his bread and butter. And he came down on those involved in these riots back in 2011 like a ton of bricks. One example was that of a 23-year-old who stole a bottle of water, and he got given 6 months in prison despite having no previous convictions. A sixth former from Wolverhampton who stole 2 left-footed trainers got 10 months behind bars. Of the people arrested and charged in those 2011 London riots, 20% of them were under 20. 25 of them were, technically speaking, children. And of course a great proportion of them, in that instance, were from ethnic minority backgrounds, unlike all the white thugs we're seeing right now. Now the longer sentences did not prove to be helpful at all as it happened. It became clear it actually promoted a cycle of reoffending. So perhaps there's a lesson to learn there. But clearly not being learnt if sending protesters down for 4 to 5 years is anything to go by. And given Starmer's involvement then, as now, then as DPP, now as Prime Minister, if the sentences of all these white thugs attacking ethnic minorities on racial grounds are comparable, it will once more invite accusations of racism against Starmer once more too. The hierarchy of racism of Keir Starmer's Labour Party. Not to mention more choruses of Two Tier Keir. And he'll still deserve it. Meanwhile, speaking of Starmer's racism and bigotry, it's come back to haunt him once more, as his weaponisation of the immigration status of Bangladeshis in this country during the general election campaign has come back to bite him on the backside. The former Prime Minister of Bangladesh, having fled the country, is now attempting to apply for asylum here in the UK. So are you going to send all these Bengalis back to Bangladesh, or are you going to invite another one here to stay because they happen to be someone of some sort of kind of position and prestige, if no longer power? That'll be another fine mess of your own making there, won't it, Keith? Get all the details of that story in this video recommendation here, and I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.